You need to do everything you possibly can to win 1 week at a time in fantasy football. Here are all the players you need to be adding off the waiver wire to do just that coming into week 15. If you're feeling generous today, please go down and hit that like button. It helps me out a ton, and it will lock in some good luck for your fantasy football team this week. But make sure to stick around to the end of the video if you do want a list of defenses that will go absolutely insane this week that I cannot believe are still sitting on the waiver wire for some reason. It blows my mind. But the first ad of the week I don't like to waste time is going to be Ray McCloud of the Atlanta Falcons. And this may come as a little bit of a surprise with how bad Kirk Cousins has been playing. Nobody can deny that, and it looks like he's forgotten how to throw touchdowns. He really hasn't had any in the past month and a half, 2 months, since November 3rd. But he does have the volume, which is perfect for these wide receivers and specifically the role that Ray McCloud does play in this offense. Mooney, he's their downfield guy. He's their field stretching guy to take the top off defenses. He has been all year, and we saw last week that paid off with 6 receptions for 142 receiving yards. That's over 20 yards per reception. That's what he does. We look at Drake London, he's their everything guy. He leads the team in targets. He takes the number one focus of the defenses and the schemes that the defenses run. Now, you look at Ray, he's their slot guy. He's the guy that finishes with 11 targets last week on 8 receptions for 98 yards against the Minnesota Vikings last week. He's going to run close to the line of scrimmage. He's going to be a volume type of guy because he plays in the slot. Statistically, those guys do get targeted at a higher clip. He's had 22 targets in his last 3 games and double-digit fantasy points in back-to-back weeks in fantasy football. Now, will that happen every single week? Probably not. There is a lot of target competition, but if you look at his last 3 games, again, he's averaging 7.6 targets and 79.6 receiving yards. That shows his potential, regardless of who's in this offense. But the real reason we need to be adding him, besides all of his internal success, and honestly, what's really important for fantasy football, he has one of the best fantasy playoff schedules and the rest of season schedules at that. You look at these next games, if you need to start him, he gets the Raiders, the Giants, and the Commanders from week 15 through week 17. Those are all positive defenses in passing yards allowed and quarterback success, but also a lot of fantasy points going to the wide receivers in those stretches of weeks. So there's a lot of target competition in this offense again, but he's a primary slot wide receiver. He's going to get that volume. His breakout potential game of going over 15 or 20 fantasy points isn't going to be as high as a guy like Darnell Mooney or Drake London, but he is one of the safest guys you can get off the waiver wire and will put up points every single week. The Falcons have to pass regardless of what matchup they come into. Their defense is not allowing them to stick to a run-heavy script and do what they do in that aspect. They're allowing 27.3 points per game over the last 2 months of football. That's 6 matchups. We can't really get much better as far as a wide receiver in fantasy football for a mix of positives to be a fantasy option. Moving into another guy though, unfortunately, Patrick Taylor is a guy we need to be adding off our waiver wire, at least as a safety valve coming into this week, because we do continue to see the 49ers running backs and offense in general scheme efficient guys. The running backs, whoever they put out there, is going to be efficient and going to put up yardage. I say this because an insane game from Isaac Guerrero just happened last week. 26.8 fantasy points on 15 attempts on the ground, 78 yards and 2 touchdowns, some work in the receiving game as well. Well, now he leaves early last week's game with a foot injury, and we have no idea what his timeline looks like. But we do know if this injury happens to build itself and he could be at risk of missing this week or even the next few, I think there's higher than a 50% chance that he does miss this matchup coming in a short week against LA. Patrick Taylor could single-handedly win you a week and advance you into the next round of the playoffs if he is the starting running back. All of the starting running backs who have ever started for the 49ers this year, whether it's Isaac Guerrero, Jordan Mason, or Christian McCaffrey, they average 20 rushing attempts a game and over 3 receptions in the receiving game. I can't stress it enough. The offensive philosophy of this team is to breed workhorse running backs. They don't do committees. He was the primary running back after Guerrero got injured, seeing 7 carries and 100% of the goal line work, which is another teller that he is trusted in this offense, compared to Keyshawn Vaughn, who only saw 2 touches total. There's a very strong chance he's a clear-cut RB1 that we can start at a flex spot if Isaac Guerrero does happen to miss. But we do need to be rostering Elijah Moore and or Cedric Tillman. Take your pick at those guys. Tillman is coming off his concussion. He's probably going to play this week in this matchup, but again, with the amount of sheer passing volume that Jameis Winston has in this offense, I don't care who these wide receivers are. They could be you. They could be me. We're going to be at least a little bit fantasy viable because you look at Jameis Winston. He's averaging 46.5 passing attempts since taking over for Deshaun Watson. And since week 8, all of his matchups have been negative. He's played Pittsburgh twice. He's played a bunch of really good defenses in the pass game and restricting in quarterback points allowed. He may not be the best fantasy quarterback in terms of wins and maybe real NFL terms, but again, that volume is great for fantasy wide receivers, and they get a matchup against Kansas City this week, which has been more positive against the pass recently in the second half of the season. They also get the Bengals the week after. I will go over that later in this video. It's just a ton of good opportunity for these wide receivers to get usage. But Kendre Miller has shown us that he needs to be considered on your team off the waiver wire for this week. He's coming off IR. He's been off and on IR for the entire season, essentially, maybe his entire career if you want to include that as well. But in his opportunities, in his career, when he is healthy, he's been extremely efficient. In his first game off IR in week 7, he saw 29% of the snaps. Again, that's a pretty good sign off your first game. Then he misses more time. He comes back from IR and sees a season high in snaps last week and 10 touches. The reason he's better than a regular handcuff like Cam Akers or like Gus Edwards is because of the situation that the Saints are in. This team, they're 5-8. They're second to last in the NFC South. Yes, they do technically still have a chance to make the playoffs, but it's not very high. If they lose one of their next 2 or even more than that, quicker than that, there could be a real risk of the Saints pushing back on Alvin Kamara and kind of restricting his usage in this offense. There's no debate if he's going to be slowed down this year. I truly believe that he will. The question is it going to happen in time for the fantasy football playoffs to make Kendre Miller an actual viable fantasy football player? Because if not, it's going to be in week 17, but most leagues are going to be over by then. You look at the next matchups for this team. It's against the Commanders, it's against the Packers, and it's against the Raiders to finish out the season. A little bit of a tough schedule, but for fantasy running back points allowed, those are all really positive matchups to running back points allowed. If he's already getting 10 carries in his first game off IR, in a win last week against the Giants that really wasn't a blowout by any means, that gives us a glimpse to what we could possibly see in the future and even as soon as the season. Miller in his healthy games this year, while yes, a really small sample size, has a 41% missed tackles forced ratio, top 10 in running back elusiveness rating, yards after contact, and a decent receiving usage out of the backfield as well. He also did get a touchdown last week, getting a few goal line attempts. That's showing more trust in him and giving us a little bit of a green light to be stashing him, especially if you do have Alvin Kamara on your roster as well. But like we called out last week, Juwan Johnson needs to be rostered in your league. I don't care how deep your fantasy football league. Taysom Hill, out for the year, ACL tear, he's going to be gone, opening up a ton of time and specifically routes run for these tight ends to run a more conventional offense, which is going to be beneficial for the tight ends. We know when Taysom Hill was healthy, he lined up at quarterback, he took some running back snaps, he really made defenses second guess their defensive coverage schemes. So now that that's not happening, they're forced to just run a regular offense with these tight ends. He went for 5 receptions on 7 targets in his first tight end 1 performance in week 13 when Taysom Hill went out. Then last week he sees 4 receptions on 5 targets and a touchdown against one of the tougher defenses in stopping tight end points allowed in the Giants last week. That's good for a 16% target share, a little bit higher than that at 16.3. Not bad as far as tight ends go in that aspect. Now Derek Carr is at risk to miss a couple weeks this week, whatever it is, against the Commanders with his injury. Regardless of who this quarterback is, I really don't care. The receiving weapons are not there. Mason Tipton, he's getting benched by coach's decision. Marquez Valdez-Scantling is their best wide receiver option. There's really nobody that can take a true level of targets away from Juwan Johnson. He's essentially this top receiving option for this team and the top talent that they have. He's a huge red zone threat. He's kind of been known for that, and that's been his trademark throughout his career in the league. He's had 2 touchdowns in his last 3 games. That's also a positive sign. And his fantasy playoff schedule for tight end points allowed is absolutely amazing. He gets the Commanders this week, then the Packers and the Raiders, all top 10 matchups as far as passing volume required, but also as far as tight end points allowed. There was going to be no shortage of volume in those matchups, but if the Saints offense isn't going to do it for you and you do need a tight end, please go through and roster Will Dissly or even Stone Smart. I say this because Dissly did leave last week's game against the Chiefs early with a shoulder injury. At the time of this recording, we don't know how serious it is. It could be 1 week, it could be no weeks, it could be the rest of the season. Probably not though. But either way, Will Dissly is rostered in only 45% of leagues. Stone Smart is only rostered in 0% of leagues. Really, nobody has him, and he did perform pretty good in his fill-in time for Will Dissly last week. Whoever is the starting tight end for this team moving forward needs to be rostered because of the tight end philosophy that they do have. They run one tight end for the entire season. They don't really split snaps at that position, so whoever it is going to be valuable. And the Chargers offense is passing a lot more than they were in the beginning of the season, again giving these guys more opportunities. Ladd McConkey's dealing with injury. He's probably going to be back this week. I don't really expect that to be anything serious, but they get a lot of pass first matchups that are positive 2 tight end points allowed in the fantasy playoffs all the way through. They get the Buccaneers, the Broncos, and the Patriots. By far, all top 10 matchups and fantasy points allowed to the tight end position. This team is more than inside of playoff contention in an extremely competitive division with the Chiefs, with the Broncos. They need to pass. They need to win. It's a great spot for these tight ends, whoever ends up being the number 1 and starting and healthy to be on our roster. But looking at a quarterback here, my first option is going to be everybody's favorite quarterback in Jameis Winston. It does not matter how bad he plays. 5 interceptions in the last 2 games. His pass volume is amazing though. That is all that it takes. Since taking over for Deshaun Watson in week 8, he has this team number 1 in passing attempts by an insane margin. Like absolutely insane. If you exclude the one game in Pittsburgh that was a blizzard, nobody was really passing and they really couldn't in that game. He's averaging 46.5 passing attempts. I really can't explain to you how insane that number is if you haven't looked at a bunch of other quarterback stats over the years. And he did all of that despite playing 5 insanely tough matchups against insanely tough defenses in fantasy points allowed as well. He's averaging 21.8 fantasy points over his starting stretch as well. That's top 5 in the NFL, which is absolutely insane to see. Now his schedule does ease up in the next coming weeks against the Chiefs this week, which is a positive one for him, but also more importantly, the Cincinnati Bengals in week 16 of the fantasy football playoffs. That is a dream matchup. You know that Jameis Winston is salivating at that matchup. You look at the team, they're allowing 34.25 points to opposing offenses over the last 4 games. The number 1 most points allowed on the year in total at 28.5. They're also allowing the 2nd most yards allowed to opposing offenses at 370. Jameis Winston is going to absolutely eat in this matchup. It doesn't matter in the Chiefs matchup. It's also a positive one. Like I've talked about earlier, they're a bit more positive as far as quarterback points and success goes. They have a great pressure rate, which might be a bit of a problem, but outside of that, Jameis Winston is going to absolutely go insane as far as his passing volume goes. But time for my favorite part of this video, the fantasy football defenses we need to be stashing, adding for this week. They are absolutely amazing. I don't understand how there's so many good options on the waiver wire this week. My number 1 option though is going to be the Arizona Cardinals. This first week of the playoffs to get a matchup against the Patriots, that's an amazing one. They're 23rd in EPA per play. They're 6th in fantasy points allowed to opposing defenses, but they also get the Panthers the week after that, who are also bottom 10 in EPA per play, even over the last month when Bryce Young filled back in, came back from being benched and is playing pretty decent, and they are top 10 in points allowed to opposing defenses. Yes, he's playing good, but he still does make a couple mistakes every game. They get the Rams in the fantasy playoffs, which isn't good. I do want to be avoiding that one, but this week and the next week after even are really great ones. They don't have the best interior unit as far as a defensive focus themselves, but in these positive matchups, it gives a little bit less risk and opportunity to start them if you don't have another top defense already on your roster. But the Falcons have also become a really strong start for the first week of the playoffs. They get a matchup against the Raiders, who we can say safely is not going to have Aiden O'Connell in this matchup here. He got carted off the field last week against the Buccaneers. That puts Desmond Ridder at their starting quarterback position. It drastically decreases their offensive upside, even with good talents like Jacoby Myers and Brock Bowers. They also get the Giants in week 15, which is another positive matchup. Drew Lock is averaging 202 passing yards per game, which isn't good, despite averaging a very high 40.5 passing attempts per contest over those last 2 weeks. He is one of the least efficient quarterbacks in the NFL. He's thrown 2 interceptions and no touchdowns in that 2-week stretch. The Giants team so far is extremely out of the playoffs. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if the offensive line just completely stops blocking for him and they give up all hope. It's a great matchup to start the Falcons, another defense that has been struggling a little bit as of late, but a deep sleeper option. If you can't get any of those guys, if you don't have good waiver priority or blew all your fab on Isaac Guerrero like I did last week, the defense we need to be getting is the Commanders. They've been putting it together, especially as of late. They're coming off their bye week, but the most important factor, they do get Marshawn Lattimore back into their defense for the very first time in a revenge game against the New Orleans Saints, a matchup where they're likely not going to have Derek Carr, who got injured last week. And it's not like Marshawn Lattimore has to guard any comparable wide receivers. Like, again, their best guy is Marquez Valdez-Scantling. It's going to be a great option for them. Their defense should probably be a lot more predictable than the other defenses in this video, and one of the more solid internal units as far as the other guys in this list. But that's going to finish off this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you in the waiver wire trap video coming tomorrow. We don't want to miss that one, especially in the fantasy football playoffs. All glory to the man above, and I'll see you in that one coming tomorrow.